Dr. John Quinto, Assistant Supervisor, and Luis Dan Gonzalez, Senior Administrative Assistant for Kings Canyon Unified School District. And at this point, we'd like to also call up Tom Zuckerman, who is from my district and active with the Delta, San Joaquin Delta area. Thank you. And would you like to go first, Ms. Puente?
Mi nombre es Elena Puente, soy residente del condado de Yolo y estoy por la comunidad de parte de Fundación Asisten Legal Rural de California. Gracias al comité por la oportunidad de presentar mi historia.
My name is Maria Elena Puente. I am with California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation from Yolo County, and thank you to the committee for allowing me to present my story.
Vengo de una familia de 10 de familia. Somos 12 con mi papá y mi mamá. Somos familia que trabajamos en diferentes áreas de agrícola. Entonces,
I belong to a family of 12, including my parents, and we work, all of us, in the farm industry, in agriculture.
nos está afectando la sequía a nosotros por parte de que a los rancheros les está dando menos tierra para cultivar. A nosotros nos están cortando horas y están corriendo la gente que es mayor de edad, como mi papá.
The drought is affecting us because the farmers, the ranchers, are getting less land to farm on it, and they are cutting jobs because of this situation, and it's affecting us.
En el caso de mi papá, él está retirado ya, pero todavía tiene familia por qué trabajar.
Yeah, like in the case of my dad, he's already retired, but he has family that needs to work in the farms.
Años atrás, mis hermanos estaban trabajando 8 meses y ahora con todo esto que está pasando, nada más les está dando 4 meses de trabajo en el campo.
Yeah. Years ago, my brothers were working 8 months, and now because of the drought, it's been cut that time to 4 months, half.
Viví por 4 años en un campo migratorio. Esta gente nada más vive 6 meses ahí y 6 meses se van a México. Y las personas que se quedan aquí están viviendo hasta de 3 familias en un solo departamento porque no les alcanza el dinero porque trabajaron muy poco.
I used to live like 4 months in those migrant camps. There is people that live there for 6 months, but now they have to live in the same house, 3, 4 families together, because the money doesn't allow them to do any other things, because they have less, the work is not the same.
Y además también las familias han tenido que, había padres de familia que nada más trabajaba el papá y ahora tienen que trabajar la mamá y empezar a dejar sus hijos desde muy temprana edad a que los cuiden.
Yeah, before the father used to be the only that was working, but now the mother has to do that too, that farm work, and they have to leave their kids without, anybody to take care of them.
Y a mí me ha tocado ver que de verdad es una tristeza que los que tienen más familia tienen que sacar a sus hijos de la escuela cuando cumplen 18 años para que se vayan al campo para ayudar a mantener la demás familia.
And I've seen people taking out of school their kids under 18 because they need the help of their little ones to work because of the drought.
Ahorita mi papá está trabajando en una arrocera, prácticamente descansaron la mitad de la gente. Él está trabajando ahí, pero nada más por 2 meses. Y antes, gracias a Dios, estábamos muy bien porque él trabajaba sus 6 meses y ahora son nada más 2 meses y con eso nos tenemos que mantener.
Yeah, before this situation, my dad used to work for 6 months, and now he's only working 2 months, even if he's retired, but he has to work on a rice farm.
Para mí y para nosotros los agricultores nos encantaría que nos dieran más, que hubiera más trabajo, más entrenamientos para nosotros para poder tener una calidad de vida mejor.
We farm workers, we would like more training in different fields and more work for us to do our job.
Porque en realidad en el campo tenemos muy poca información de muchas cosas que no nos informan. Ahorita como estamos trabajando menos personas en el field, nos están poniendo a tirar fertilizantes y a veces no nos dan el entrenamiento que requerimos.
Yeah, farm workers don't get the information that there is other programs that we can do when this situation is affecting us. And like, for example, there is people working on the with pesticides, and they don't get the information to do it safely, so they get sick and other things.
Y pues esto nos está afectando y también la agua que nos están dando, porque otro día no se puede tirar el agua por ahorrar agua, nos están dando esta misma otro día.
And also because of the situation with the drought, the farm workers are getting water from other days that they don't, instead of throwing the water out, they give us that water, which is not very, safe.
Y nosotros como trabajadores del campo estamos acostumbrando a llevar una botellita de agua cargando con nosotros, pero a veces nos tenemos que aguantar todo ese tiempo nada más con una botella de agua y 12 horas trabajadas.
Yeah, sometimes we need to stay 12 hours working with only a small water bottle.
A mí me encantaría, como les vuelvo a decir, que nos den la oportunidad de que podemos hacer otras cosas mejor, pero sí necesitaríamos más información, porque en realidad
Yeah, we would like to do other other jobs in different fields now that the drought is affecting us, but we need more information about what kind of programs can we assist or can we get training on.
y porque además para nosotros es muy peligroso andar tirando los fertilizantes sin saber cómo hacerlo y además eso nos está afectando también.
Yeah, one example is that when we work with pesticides, we don't have the proper training and it's affecting our health.
Muchas de las familias están pensando en moverse a otras ciudades para poder vivir mejor.
Too many families are thinking about moving to a different state to have a better life.
Pues eso es todo esa es mi historia y me gustaría en verdad que la tomen en cuenta porque cuando uno está trabajando en el campo es donde puede ver todo esto que está pasando.
That would be my story, and we would like to get help because when we work in the farms, that's when you see what's going on because of the drought and how it's affecting us.
Y como yo hay muchas personas, pero a veces la verdad nos da miedo hablar porque no queremos perder nuestros trabajos. Yo sé que son menos horas y todo, pero entonces ¿de qué nos vamos a mantener?
In my same situation, there is other persons, and we are afraid to talk because we are afraid to lose our jobs, and even there is less hours to work. We need it to keep our families.
Y por eso estamos aceptando lo que nos dicen ellos. Tenemos que hacer lo que nos dicen por no perder nuestros propios trabajos.
So we have to accept what the farmers, the ranchers tell us, so we don't lose our jobs.
Pues muchas gracias por escuchar mi situación, mi historia.
Thank you very much for listening to my story.
Thank you. Next, we have Dr. John Quinto, Assistant Supervisor, which is it? Okay. Please.
Yes, Senator I'm going to butcher this, so Galgiani?
Galgiani.
Okay, Senator for committee members. Appreciate the honor to come to speak about the economic impact this had on a school district, or Kings Canyon Unified School District. We serve the K-12 public school needs of about 10,000 students in an area of about 600 square miles. The drought has impacted our farming communities of Reedley and Orange Cove. What we've seen is a 3-year decline in enrollment. So there's a 238 over the last 3 years. If you look at that, for us, that equates to about $2.5 million in loss of revenue or incoming. One of the things we do to mitigate that impact is looking at class sizes. And so depending on the community, the 238 students equates to about 6 teachers. And so we look to mitigate it first that way, but also ensuring that we're not negatively impacting their student instruction. The second thing we do is there's a soft fall P2 guarantee, which allows us to softly fall when we lose revenue in that fashion. So that's critical for us. So thank you for the legislation that allows for that. LCFF has actually helped us, Proposition 98. We have about 87% lower socioeconomic students, and so we've actually benefited from LCFF, or local control funding formula. So as that comes up and you're getting more dollars per student, we're seeing a decline in students. So it's helping mitigate that measure, or mitigating the ramifications of our drought. Lastly, a cash management plan is mission critical. And so the board takes its fiduciary responsibility very seriously. So they keep a high reserve for such circumstances. So the practice is to keep about 18 to 20% so that we can utilize that so we're not impacting any programs or activities for our students. One of the things we'd like to speak to is, and most importantly to us, is the impact we're seeing on our students. So I think that with the high reserves, LCFF, we can get through, if it's not long lasting, we can get through the $2.5 million loss in revenue and that. But one of the biggest things that we're seeing, and why we brought Mr. Luis Gonzalez, is to speak on the impact on our students. So if you wouldn't mind, sir.
Thank you. I guess I wanted to speak specifically to the impact of the students that I've seen, specifically in my time working at Orange Cove High School from the drought. One thing that I'm seeing is students not being involved in as many extracurricular activities. Excuse me. I'm finding that students are having to leave home right after school to go home to care for younger siblings because, as Mrs. Puente spoke, both parents are having to work now. Before, where one parent was able to stay at home and care for children, now older children, high school age students, are going home to take care of their younger siblings right after school and not being involved in many extracurricular activities. In that same respect, high school age students are coming to school a lot later. And when you're asking them, and letting them know how it's affecting their attendance, and you're asking them, what's your reason for coming to school late? Well, my parents are leaving to work much earlier now because they're having to go find work further from home. So they have to wake up earlier, dress their younger brothers and sisters, and take them to school because the parents are leaving really early in the morning to go find work or get work in farther communities. Other things that I'm seeing is when the younger siblings are sick. Once again, the older age students are having to stay home with them because when there was plenty of work, one parent was allowed to stay at home to care for the sick child. But now, any work that they're able to get, they're not willing to pass up. So they're keeping home the older students to stay with the younger siblings, and they're going to work. Also, I've seen I think a reduction in parent involvement with the school, once again, because they're working more, later hours, further distances. So, you know, in some of the committees where we require or request for parent involvement, the attendance in that has gone down. Also, in support to some of the students that are involved in activities, you know. So the students that we do have involved in sports or after-school activities, because they don't have to stay home and care for children, maybe they're the youngest already, so parents are out, you know, working, and they're not able to come to a football game to support their kid because they're out working, or because there's not enough money, and the money needs to be prioritized to food, shelter, clothing, and not so much to go out and support their kids in some of the extracurricular activities that they're involved in. So I think that does hurt some of the students that are in their support because of the drought. The drought is affecting how much more the parents are working, and the students are being affected directly in that way. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Tom Zuckerman.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm here on short notice, and
Thank you.
I'm going to talk about problems that we are encountering and solutions that have been implemented in the Delta itself. I come from a longtime farming family in the Delta. Starting well over 100 years ago, we've been farming there. I personally have a career up here as a lawyer and a lobbyist, but been involved in many agricultural operations, not only in the Delta, but in all over the western United States and into some foreign countries. So I have a broader perspective on this, perhaps, than the typical tractor driving farmer might have in our area. But it's important when you start to analyze impacts on the Delta to understand some of the physical factors involved. The Delta is nominally at sea level, so there's never an issue with water in quantity. If the outflow from coming through the Delta from its tributaries is insufficient to repel the ocean comes back up into the Delta, pushed by the tides on a diurnal basis. So the issue of water in the Delta is one of water quality, not of the presence of water. And that has been true historically, and it's certainly been true during the current drought. Salinity intrusion is an issue that we look at very carefully. We were to receive protection from both the Federal Central Valley Project and the State Water Project as conditions of their construction. Part of their basic purposes were to provide salinity control in the Delta area. We have what are considered to be very, very senior water rights based largely upon riparian usage, but also on pre-14 and post-14 appropriations that have been filed by our area. And primarily, the basic protection is provided by the common pool concept that unless the water quality in the Delta is maintained at acceptable levels, it's unsuitable for export from the Delta because of the point of diversion that takes place in the southern portion of the Delta. So historically, the State Water Resources Control Board has established water quality standards, not only for fish and wildlife uses and domestic uses, but also for agricultural uses in the Delta. There are critical year relaxations that are based upon historical droughts. Unfortunately, what seems to be happening, instead of adhering to those critical year standards, which were designed for those purposes, every time we encounter a drought, which, as Dr. Lund pointed out to you, has been 8 times in recent history, we get declarations of emergency from the governor's office, and typically all bets are off at that point. This year, the state board instituted relaxations in water quality standards in the Delta that amounted to taking about 1 million acre-feet of water that might ordinarily have flowed out of the Delta and help repulse salinity to the export projects. So it's a mixed bag. I know people down the valley tend to think that the Delta is taking all their water. Well, we look at it the other way around. And the promises that were made to the area are hard to enforce. And so we rely very heavily upon this common pool concept where we will share in the hardships but not be victimized by them. What happens to us in a salinity intrusion situation is that the salt concentrations in the water increases, and particularly towards the western delta, the accumulation of salt in the soil may not necessarily impact the current year's crop because it's late in the season. The crops are more tolerant of salty water late in the maturation, but they accumulate in the soils. And the Deputy Secretary of Food and Agriculture was talking about this being the year of soils. Well, soils are not happy in the western delta and in the delta generally this year because the combination of increased salt in the water that's being irrigated and the methodology that's used, which is sub-irrigation. It's not top irrigation, which can enable you to wash salts out of the soil with excess irrigation, but it works the other way. The plants have their own mechanism for not absorbing salt, and they leave it in the root zone, and soils get very salty. This is an issue for drip irrigation all over the state as well, and unless farmers in mineral soils that utilize drip irrigation employ methodologies for over-irrigating their soils or leaching the soils, they're going to end up with very similar problems after periods of use. So it's a generalized problem. The way that we responded to this in the Delta this year, I think, is illustrative of the willingness and ability of people to work together as much as possible in tough times. There was a program that was adopted voluntarily within the Delta this year by most of the farmers, all the ones that I'm familiar with, or most of the ones I'm familiar with, to voluntarily reduce their usage by 25%. And the way they did that, and it was many times because it was in concern about not only the buildup of salts if they did irrigate, but also there were threats coming from the State Water Resources Control Board of curtailment of these senior water rights uses, which the lawyers in the area said were inappropriate, but nevertheless, in order to avoid a fight over the thing, this program was signed up, and as a consequence, the State Board did not come down and attempt to curtail water rights diversions against the people, at least the ones that participated in the program. The way they were able to do it was through a combination of fallowing and, to some extent, cutting off irrigations that might otherwise have occurred later in the season, particularly as the water was getting saltier. And that worked in a couple of ways. One, if a farmer had, for instance, alfalfa, they just didn't irrigate the last one or two irrigations, and that had an impact upon the amount of hay that was produced on those crops. Another interesting way that it happened was because the dairy farmers were running up short of hay to feed to their animals, and they were more interested in ensiling corn, with green chopping corn, and making silage out of it, which is a substitute crop for the dairy animals. That has the impact of allowing you to harvest the crop well short of its normal maturity, and again, save the irrigations that would have taken place later on in the season. Now, back in the early 90s, I think it was either 90 or 91, we had a drought, and the state instituted a drought bank program. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember that.
What year was this?
It was either 90 or 91. And people were actually paid to not plant crops in the Delta. It was some questionable whether it was very effective or not, and in the subsequent year, a group of us suggested a program to the Department of Water Resources and the Department of, at that time, Fish and Game, now Fish and Wildlife, to do a crop shift program where instead of farming crops that were irrigated during the summer, shifted to either winter irrigated crops like wheat, barley, and so forth, or crops that didn't require any irrigation during the latter part of the year when the water really begins to get short. That was a very effective program. We were able to save about 1.5 acre-feet per acre of the lands that were put into the program. Unfortunately, the year in which it was instituted turned out to be a wet year. And so the people that paid the people in the Delta not to do this were a little bit disappointed with it. But all the reports that were done on it showed that it was very effective. So that's something that could be done in exigencies off into the future. A couple of things you need to understand about this drought situation, though, is that the system is inherently short of water. When the State Water Project was proposed to the people, it was recognized that sometime around 2000 it was going to begin to run out of water. And the amount of water that had been contracted for sale south of the Delta and into the Bay Area and so forth was going to end up being about 5 million acre-feet short because of and they anticipated developing that 5 million acre-feet of water through additional storage projects at that time on the North Coast rivers, by and large. And then along came the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and so forth, and that was all put, out of reach. So the system, as Dr. Lund says, ends up being about 8 million acre-feet short this year. And that 5 million acre-feet is a big portion of that. So these kinds of events are going to happen with increasing frequency as we go forward unless we do something dramatic about it. The most obvious thing, and the thing that those of us in the Delta have been preaching for at least 8 years now, is the integration of stormwater management with groundwater recharge. And there's an enormous capacity that's been created by overpumping in the valley. It's estimated to be at least 500 million acre-feet of available storage in the San Joaquin Valley alone that could be utilized to take not all, but a significant portion of the water that is going to be falling, largely as rain rather than snow now, and trying to figure out ways to utilize historic floodplains, which may be farmed now, but you can flood them on a seasonal basis if they don't have permanent crops that would be destroyed by it, and really get serious about putting some water down in the bank that we'll have to use to alleviate these problems with the jobs on the farm and the kids in the schools and so forth, and not be in this boom or bust type of situation that we have today. The last thing I want to point out to you, and I would have been more succinct if I had more time to prepare, I suppose, but I apologize for taking perhaps more time than is reasonable. But a lot of people don't understand this one simple fact, that if farming becomes uneconomical in the Delta, there will be nobody there to maintain the levee systems. And we get a lot of water into the island from seepage. And we have huge drainage systems on all these lands that pump all the water that we don't use back into the channels. And oftentimes we're pumping more water back into the channels than we're actually diverting onto the lands, depending upon the time of the year and the seasons. If there isn't somebody there to do that, these islands will fill up with water. The problem with that is that the evapotranspiration uses about 40 to 50% more water than we do in farming. So the consumption of water in the delta will increase by that amount if these islands are not maintained in agriculture, or at least in a non-flooded circumstance, which will even be worse. It'll add to this shortage that we have in the system today. The other thing we need to realize is that when these crops are not grown, or if, for instance, if they're harvested early, like silage corn deal, there's a lot of habitat for terrestrials and waterfowl and so forth that isn't there also. There was an article in the Sacramento Bee over this last weekend about the stress on the waterfowl populations as a result of not having the flooded rice fields that would ordinarily have existed. Well, that is also true with these areas that have gone from corn, where there's waste grain in the field after the corn harvest, to a green shop deal where it's a scorched earth type situation for the balance of the summer. So there's a lot of aspects to this that you need to keep in mind as policy going forward. And I think I've probably exhausted my time and more. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, and thank you for participating and preparing on such short notice. We had another panelist who had a family emergency, and Tom Zuckerman is filling in for her, so I appreciate that very, very much.
And I didn't have a chance to talk to Barbara. I had no idea what she was preparing to say, so I hope I didn't get too far off the
No,
subject.
thank you. It was very helpful, very informative. Thank you. Okay, so do we have any questions of these panelists from any of our members?
I'll start if you don't mind. Just a quick question, Madam Chair, for our representatives from Kings Canyon. First, welcome. They're my constituents, at least for the next 4 weeks. I look forward to, it's been an honor to work with you and serve you for the last 5 years and for the rest of this year. But what I wanted to talk to you about is, you brought up some of the real world impacts that are facing families, kids, schools as a result of work not being as available. I'm wondering, have you all thought at a very grassroots level, are there any state policies or state budgetary requirements that could maybe be changed, loosened up, to allow more flexibility for you to, as administrators, to deal with sort of the real world impacts that are occurring due to the drought with your students?
I can't think of any right now.
Okay.
One of the beauties with LCFF, the new funding formula, is the LCAP, the Local Control Accountability Plan. And so it actually promotes going out to the communities and getting feedback. The tension is between, as Mr. Gonzalez brought up, was trying to get people to the table to talk about what activities. So there's some funding in the supplemental concentrated portion of the LCFF that would allow the flexibility, but it's getting those participants to come in, and how do we do that? Is it about coming through and helping feed them? So can we provide after-school programming? Could we come in with some kind of a breakfast program? But trying to get them to come in and to speak about it has been the challenge, sir.